My name's Ken Dudek, and I'm the president of Fountain House. I'd like to welcome you to Fountain House and our beautiful wellness center. I'm glad you'll be joining us for what promises to be an interesting conversation about a provocative and an important concept, asylum. This event is being led and was conceptualized by Kathleen Pike, director of the Global Mental Health Program at Columbia. She has secured the participation of various experts with an array of perspectives on this topic. Together with Kathy's program at Columbia, Grand Challenges Canada, and Cities Rise, Fountain House will host a 2-day international conference beginning tomorrow morning called Healthier, Longer Lives. Kathy thought it would be a good idea to have this discussion about asylums as a kickoff to our conference and to the work we will be doing over the next 2 days. We wanted to hold this panel here so you can all see what is possible when you design places of beauty where a vibrant community can exist. The house in Fountain House comes from the settlement house movement. They were community centers which helped new immigrants settle into new communities. This community was created in 1948, 70 years ago, by and for people with serious mental illness. In fact, it was created by 7 former patients upon their release from a state mental hospital. We have had over 20,000 members of this community. Our place existed before the discovery of psychiatric medication, and it even preceded deinstitutionalization. Originally, the founders called their group "We Are Not Alone." They believed that if they could sustain the camaraderie they had established in the hospital, connect with volunteers and professionals, that they would create an inclusive and stigma-free environment in the community where they could recover and thrive. Today, Fountain House continues to represent a unique school of thought in the world of community mental health. We believe strongly in intentional communities in place and in bringing common-minded people together in that place. With our many partners, Fountain House has inspired the creation of hundreds of similar programs throughout the US, Europe, Argentina, India, Pakistan, Uganda, and more than 30 countries. Every day, people with schizophrenia, bipolar, and major depression come to places like Fountain House because they know they are safe, stigma-free, supportive environments, but they also know that they're launching pads that will help them return to and succeed in the world at large. For some, that means returning to work, for others, school, but for all, it means having a purpose and contributing to society, to become citizens of the world. Thank you all for coming to Fountain House, and now I'd like to introduce you to a member of Fountain House, Vini Scram.
Thank you, Ken, and welcome everyone. My name is Vini Scram, and I've been a member of Fountain House for 16 years. The Fountain House community has helped me realize many hopes and dreams during this time, from living independently, finishing my associate's degree, becoming a certified peer specialist, and now working with others in the community living with mental illness. But before I was a member of Fountain House, my life was very different. I was hospitalized multiple times, including a stay in Greystone Park Psychiatric Hospital in New Jersey, which many consider a modern-day asylum. I know what it is like to have your freedom stripped and not live in the community. I also know what it is like to be a valued member of the community, to have a place and purpose, and to be able to contribute my skills. I'm very interested in our conversation that we are about to have and to hear from our panelists. Thank you.
Good afternoon, and welcome to Asylums, Reframing the Narrative. I'm Kathleen Pike. I serve as professor of psychology and director of the WHO Collaborating Center at Columbia University in mental health and global mental health. I'm also the niece of Henry Pike, my uncle who died in a psychiatric institution, which is where he spent his entire adult life. In his early 20s, along with being diagnosed with schizophrenia, Uncle Hank, as we called him, received a dishonorable discharge from the military, and his mother, my grandmother, was labeled a schizophrenogenic mother. Remember those days? Uncle Hank lived on a locked ward for more than 50 years. He was not among those discharged in the wake of the Community Mental Health Act in the 60s. I'm not sure why. It's true that his voices were rarely quiet, and he had ideas about the world that didn't map onto mine. But he wasn't violent, and I'm not sure why he needed to be locked up. His recreation was going out for a smoke, and with the passage of the years, his overall health declined steadily. He was 6 years younger than my dad, and he died 10 years ago. So he is a case in point of what we know. People with serious mental illness can expect shorter lives and less healthy lives. This afternoon's discussion, Asylums, Reframing the Narrative, is the opening of the Healthier, Longer Lives International Conference. Why begin with asylums? Two words associated with asylum are safety and shelter. The asylum movement was a progressive, even an enlightened movement in its day. That was about 150 years ago. And as we all know, asylums gave way to institutions that gave way to overcrowding and human rights violations. Around the world, such institutions continue to warehouse individuals with serious mental illness, and the vast majority of mental health budgets are allocated for such institutions. We are opening our program with a focus on asylum not to revisit the past, but to imagine the future. How do we reframe the narrative of safety and shelter? Safety broadly conceived. Safe to engage in one's own care, secure in one's civil rights will not be violated, unharmed by treatments that are intended to heal, unscathed by stigma, ignorance, and prejudice. Shelter. Where we lay our heads to sleep is perhaps one of the most profound and defining aspects of our daily lives. The place we call home is much more than an address. It becomes a central part of our identities. It's likely that every one of us will lay our heads to sleep in a hospital bed at some point in our lives. But what does it mean to be hospitalized against our will? To be institutionalized due to mental illness? When does that make sense? How long do we stay? Why? And who decides? I know something about mental illness. I know my story, my understanding of my family's story. It's my truth. But it's also subject to the shortcomings of the single story. And I know that all of us here today have a story. Each of us we know something. But alone, none of us knows enough to address the serious gaps that exist around the world when it comes to building community and systems of care that truly support healthier, longer lives for individuals with serious mental illness. Our goal this afternoon is to hear from many individuals, to put together the kaleidoscope of experiences so that our collective story is greater than the sum of the individual parts. Our panel members here have agreed to help us open this afternoon's discussion by sharing their experiences and ideas. They are a diverse group, intentionally. I'm going to ask each one of our panelists a different question. They're going to open with about a 3-minute reply, and then we'll have a more free-flowing conversation. And then following our panel discussion, we will have small groups for all of you to participate in and be heard that will then report back to the larger group. And for those of you who are participating online, there will be ways for you also to send in your comments. Our success reframing the narrative on asylums will depend on our ability to listen and really hear the range of ideas shared. Success will be a function of how much we learn by listening. And so, to paraphrase the sages from thousands of years ago, tonight is a beginning. It's not our responsibility to finish the work of perfecting the world, but neither are we free to desist from beginning. So let us start. We're going to start with our first panelist, who is Stefan Robinson. And Stefan, my question for you, I'm not going to provide biographies because I think people have that information. Is that correct? Or should I provide a brief biography? Brief biography. So Stefan is, let me get my correct brief biographies here, is a certified recovery practitioner and director of collaborative support programs at the Donald Mays Junior Community Wellness Center. And Stefan, my question for you, you were hospitalized from age 14 to 26 years old.
Yes, 12 years.
Resulting in basically your adolescence and early adult development, all of it taking place in the confines of an institutional setting.
Yes, correct.
What were, let's say, 2 of the greatest impediments to your being helped? And what were 2 things that have been most important to your recovery and being with us today?
Well, one of the things that helped me was when I got out, I came to the Community Wellness Center, where I direct now, and they gave me support and resources and linkages to help myself and better myself and learn different skill sets, such as cooking, driving, going to school, and different things like that. So I took lead to it. And, you know, without that, I don't think I wouldn't have probably even relapsed or something like that, because, you know, the support that was there, and they gave me so much positive feedback, and I grew from that, and now I'm the director of it.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
And any specific impediment that you want to share with us?
Well, one thing that I got from it was that the feedback that people helped me with, one thing was I didn't know anything. So I had to learn how to drive, and I had to learn to cook. I had my own place and housing and stuff like that. So I had to learn all those skills over because, as Dr. Pike said, I was hospitalized since the age of 14, and I got out at 26. So it was new things I had to do again. It's like relearning my own way, and which I did. You know, I got my license. I graduated in May this year with my degree in criminal justice. I have my own house. I'm a house owner and different things like that. So it definitely is possible. It definitely is.
Wonderful. I just want to warn you that we could have a whole afternoon, a whole day discussion with each of these panelists. So this is a little bit of a teaser, but they're just an incredible group of individuals who care passionately about these issues. So thank you for starting us off.
No problem. Thank you.
So I would next like to pose a question to Pete Early, who is a family member and author and real advocate for individuals with serious mental illness. Pete, your son has been hospitalized and involved in the criminal justice system because of his mental disorder, as you discuss in your book, Crazy, A Father's Search Through America's Mental Health Madness. In what way could the mental health system have better served your son to prevent the legal system from becoming part of his story?
I'm going to talk really fast because I want to get on my 3 minutes in. I'm going to use a human example. The first time my son had a break, it was here. He's at Pratt University, Pratt Institute. I took him to a psychiatrist. The psychiatrist said, if you're lucky, he's using drugs. Well, he wasn't using drugs. So the psychiatrist said, I'm not going to sugarcoat this. Your kid has an incurable disease. He will never get better. He'll be on medication the rest of his life. He will never work. He will never marry. And oh yeah, he'll die 25 years before everyone else. And when we left that room, my son turned to me and said, Dad, that guy's crazy. Second time he had a break, he was thrown down and shot with Haldol by 2 security guards. Third time, I rushed him to an emergency room, was told he's not dangerous enough. Bring him back after he tries to kill you or someone else. He broke into a stranger's house to take a bubble bath, and he was charged with 2 felonies. The fourth time, he was off his meds. I called Mobile Crisis Response. They said, we have 1.5 million people in Fairfax County. We don't have time for this. You call us when he's dangerous. Well, the night he was violent, I called. They said, oh, we don't come if they're violent. Call the cops. The cops came. They shot him with a taser, and they hogtied him. The 5th time, I was finally able to get him in our system. Now, I used to work at the Washington Post. I live in Fairfax County, and while I'm not wealthy, it's one of the wealthiest counties in the United States. I have contacts, people like Mike Wallace, Ben Bradley, all those folks. And I thought I knew the system, and I couldn't get my kid help. And you want to talk about barriers? What do you think about someone who has no education, no money, who has maybe doesn't even speak the language, and who is psychotic? How do they get in the system? The problem is we have created a crisis-driven system, a reactive system, not a proactive system. We wait until people get to the worst part of their disease, and then we'd rather arrest them and put them in jail or leave them homeless than try to help them. And that's what we got to change.
Thanks, Pete. I'd now like to pose a question to Sudipto Chatterjee. Sudipto is with the National Institute of Advanced Studies in India. And Sudipto, you've written extensively on the idea that long-term care options are necessary for comprehensive mental health system. And you've called for transforming existing mental health hospitals and residential care centers into modern-day institutions. From your perspective, what is the most essential component to undertaking this transformation?
Okay, thanks, Kathy, and it's a real honor and privilege to be here, and I'm very grateful that I'm given a chance to speak to in such a fantastic environment. So when Kathy, you asked me about this question, I had a couple of thoughts running in my head. That we're talking about the modernization of asylums, we're talking about how we can change them. And as you know, I've been working on this issue for a while now. And I just thought it might be an idea to take a step back in time, because what we're talking about is how do we make something which is obviously not right modern. And obviously the contrast is with something that has happened in the past. And as you pointed out, you know, asylums in their day were a radical disruption. They were fantastic. The ideology was absolutely probably the only thing that was there at that point of time. Care, compassion, the fact that you could connect to people, all the words that we use at this point of time were actually enshrined in the idea of the asylum. But what I see as the fundamental and the most difficult issue that I think we need to deal with in this transformation process is that the very act of creation of an asylum, where you separate and you take a person out of society for his so-called recovery, there is a fundamental, almost a dialectical tension in that. Because once you do that, it's very difficult. I mean, the idea is good that you want to make a stress-free environment, but then life is not stress-free, and going back is very, very difficult. So I think it's very important when we talk about the modernization of asylums to fundamentally acknowledge that in itself the idea contains a Janus-faced kind of thing. There is the idea of respite, there is the idea of recovery, a safe space, but it is also disconnected. And in whatever way we create it, big, small, medium, this dialectical tension does not go away. So as part of our work, and I'm very glad that one of my colleagues, Hamid, is here as well, when we looked at this whole idea of how do we transform and modernize asylums, I think what struck us is the whole debate or the whole construct of asylums is linked to a physical space, an institution, an infrastructure. But what if we can decouple these two? What if we can say that individuals, families, communities are also part of the larger network, have to be part of a larger network? You cannot have an institution, even of excellence, standing in isolation, because that's not going to work. So part of our work has been to create these integrated pathways of a care, of making treatments, making rehabilitation, work, employment, joy, the simple fact of joy and happiness available in people's lives across the spectrum from the hospital community, and that has been truly rewarding. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we're going to move on to Michael Francic, who has come to us from Arizona and is joining us as Director of Population Health with Partners in Recovery, and who has been very much involved in the community, building communities for individuals with serious mental illness in Arizona, quite in response to Sudipto's comments. So Michael, based on your experience as Director of Population Health at Partners in Recovery, what have you learned about what has worked well and what hasn't worked in providing housing for people with serious mental illness?
Well, I also have worked for the Department of Justice on the Olmstead lawsuit, and I've been to many states, and I've been to many institutions. I've been to many state hospitals. Many of the times I went and left, and I said I would not send my family member there. And if I can't do that, then I don't think the facility is a wholesome place. Many of the things you said, I could echo. But let me tell you a little bit about population health. You realize only about 5% of the people spend somewhere to 60 or 70% of the Medicaid funds for mental health services. It's not the 95%, it's the 5%. The way I see it, mental illness, and I have a brother who has mental illness causes chaos, not only in the person's life, but in the family life, in the community life, in the neighborhood life, in the landlords, in the police who interact with people, in all aspects. And many times our systems are built, and some states have built much more comprehensive systems than others. I can tell you some states have essentially nothing. You cannot put chaos and tame it into a structured, highly structured box. You're never going to be able to do that. So in my job in population health, I look at what the system calls high utilizers. And funders look at that and say, hey, these people are using all kinds of resources. Why aren't you doing something more about it? I call them familiar faces. I mean, they're in and out of the hospitals, in and out of the emergency rooms, causing chaos wherever they go, and families who are in distress because they can't get the help they need. What we need, particularly in housing, is flexible housing that allows individuals that you know are going to make mistakes to remain in that housing and not treat real rigidly landlord-tenant acts and say, you did this in the yard and you got to go. And in many places, and even in Arizona, there are providers who evict people very rapidly for what I consider minor and silly offenses. So the important thing is to, as I'm looking at the cases that I am assigned, and I have a team of care managers and things like that, we find that many times today, with appropriate supports and ongoing supports and the great medications that are now available, we can contain some of that mental illness aspect of chaos. We're not having much luck containing the medical illness side of things, and we're also not having much luck containing the social aspects of things, meaning housing, food, supplies. So, but I like what you're thinking.
Terrific. Thank you. So our next panelist is Bharti Patel, who is here from South Africa, the National Executive Director of the South African Federation for Mental Health. Bharti, I'd like to ask you if you can share with us what has been the result of deinstitutionalization in South Africa, and what could have gone differently that would have made it more successful in your view?
Thank you. Good afternoon to you all. Deinstitutionalization in South Africa started a long time ago. It just wasn't very prominent. It wasn't a policy. It was just a decision made where there were fewer and fewer hospital beds made available in psychiatric hospitals, increasing the bed space in general hospitals, but really not getting patients out of the hospital. So patients were actually kept in hospital in tertiary institutions for more than 6 to 9 months. So everyone has heard about Life Esidimeni, which is a tragedy that started in 2015. Despite us having a very wonderful policy on mental health, which was launched in 2013, the Gauteng Department of Health, which is a province in Johannesburg or in South Africa, that decided to release patients out of state facilities. 2,000 patients were, within a space of 3 months, removed without consultation, without informing family members. They were moved into community-based facilities which were unlicensed. Now, the South African Federation for Mental Health has 17 organizations, and we run quite a few community-based facilities which are licensed by the Department of Health. But what the state did was go and find homes that were barren, abandoned, and found family or community members who had no experience in mental health to look after these patients. And these patients died. 144 of them died. And the department or the health officials actually took responsibility for that and have compensated families. But it doesn't make things right in South Africa. And the challenge that we have right now is, despite that policy which follows the World Health Organization principles in terms of deinstitutionalization, it's not being adopted by the provincial health authorities. And because we have a huge divide between national and provincial, we can't get our provincial political leaders to buy into the policy. So I think that's where we are struggling with it. And we hope and we pray and we will fight to make sure that we get our voices heard so that the policy is implemented. Thank you.
Thank you, Bharti. So essentially, is it accurate to say that if the policy were a reality, the reality would be transformational?
Most definitely. It's not going to be overnight, but it will take years. But the idea is to invest in community-based mental health services before actually following a process of deinstitutionalization.
Thank you. Okay. And now I'd like to welcome John Snook, who serves as Executive Director at the Treatment Advocacy Center. So John, how could asylums be reimagined to address issues impacting people with serious mental illness in a humane and cost-effective way?
Thank you very much. I know we only have 3 minutes, but I wanted to take just a moment to do a bit of a reality check and a level setting. The reality is this conversation is almost over in America. And unless we solve this problem from a mental health side soon, the decisions will be finalized by the criminal justice system. States across the country, mental illness is a criminal justice issue. In Alaska, in New Hampshire, and almost in Colorado until the governor vetoed it, it was legal, and it is currently legal, to take men and women to the state prison to be provided mental health care without any crime, just because there simply are no beds left. The reality is our beds are there, they're behind bars. So what do we do to make a system that works? The reality is we just need to think about this as we do with any other illness. We need a full continuum of care that treats mental illness like any other illness. For some individuals, that will require inpatient care. For a smaller percentage, it will require a more significant period of time, but we have models where that works. Therapeutic settings, therapeutic farms, places like Worcester in Massachusetts provide that sort of intensive level of care that we have lost as a system in a way that's both community-oriented and comprehensive, allowing people to be involved in both their own care and in their communities, so that they aren't warehoused, they aren't given away. They're allowed to remain hopeful and understand that care is needed. But the reality is that cannot happen until we start to take serious mental illness seriously. Right now, if you have schizophrenia, there's an 80% chance that at some point in your life you are going to come into contact with the criminal justice system. When you are hospitalized, you are going to receive care, if you're lucky, in an inpatient facility, even if you are severely ill, for 7 days. In 1980, the average was 42 days. Every psychiatrist in here knows 7 days isn't long enough to figure out if you're even on the right medication, let alone figure out what you need to get well in the community, what your family might need. It just simply isn't long enough. And so I think the question of asylums is almost too loaded a concept. The idea that we need to look at is, what do we need to do to get people well? And in some instances, just like every illness, it may require inpatient hospitalization, but that isn't a bad thing. It's a reality of the illness, and it's an opportunity for us to step up, because if we don't, the moment's almost gone.
Thank you, John. Thank you, John. I'd now like to welcome Ellen Sachs. Ellen is the director of the Sachs Institute for Mental Health Law, Policy, and Ethics, and the associate dean and Orrin B. Evans Professor of Law, Psychology, and Psychiatry, and the Behavioral Sciences at USC Gould Law School. Welcome, Ellen. My question for you is, as an internationally recognized researcher in the intersection between mental illness and the law, what would be the one question you would like the answer to that you think would help most realize healthier, longer lives for individuals with serious mental illness?
Thank you, Kathy. Great question. Really honored to be part of this group. I think, there are sort of a lot of really interesting issues around mental health. How do we distinguish it from eccentricity or difference? What's the appropriate response? My own view is I have schizophrenia, that I suffer from a biochemical illness that requires medication and therapy for me to do well and not to enact the grave prognosis I was given. But that's not because I've done the heavy philosophical lifting, but for the pragmatic reason that it makes my life better, and it's up to individuals themselves what works for them. So the one question I would want to ask is, how do we get people to want needed care so we don't have to use force or involuntary treatment? And I would like to study that question. I imagine 3 groups. The first group, and I'm talking to some people at UCLA about doing this study. The first group are people who immediately commit to treatment and continue doing it. At the other end are people who either episodically or completely resist treatment. And the people in the middle are people who start off resisting treatment, but then, quote, tip to wanting treatment. And studying what gets people to tip may lead us to be able to help people tip sooner and reduce a lot of the kind of pain and morbidity of the illness. So that's what I would think.
Thank you so much. Elizabeth Ford, welcome. It's my pleasure to turn to you next. Elizabeth Ford is Chief of Psychiatry for Correctional Health Services, New York City's Health and Hospitals. And Elizabeth,
Yes, ma'am.
you've spent your career working in both psychiatric hospital settings and in correctional facilities. I met Elizabeth in the lobby. She said, I haven't gotten here so quickly from the jail in, ever. And so they let her out of the jail to come. And so as psychiatrist in this correctional facility, what do you think is the most ideal setting for people with serious mental illness? And do you have particular models in mind that you believe we should doing more of for those who have serious mental illness and come in contact with the law?
Yes. So first of all, I'm glad I'm at the tail end of the questions. I agree with everything that's been said, and there's some really remarkable ideas. The question about the ideal setting for people with serious mental illness, I think is a tricky one. There is not an ideal setting for everybody with serious mental illness. It's a very diverse group. My experience is largely with patients who are either involuntarily civilly committed or involuntarily criminally committed. And none of them are there because they want to be. And yet, even within that group, there are many ranges of individuals who have different needs, who thrive under different kinds of conditions. And so the comment about a continuum of care and maybe not a facility-based asylum, but connecting all types of services, I think is the most ideal kind of concept. When much of what I have learned about what would be helpful is from my patients. And there's sort of 4 big themes that come up from the patients I treat about what would be most helpful for them. And I think they are the best source of this, really. The first is to have continuity of care, some kind of system where you're not seeing a new person every time. It's challenging it's hard for me. I'm shy by nature. It's hard to just sort of meet a lot of new people and then share your life experience with them. It's very challenging, whether you have illness or not. To feel safe. And that's actually something we've been working on in the jail, to try to help people feel safe, which sounds a little counterintuitive. But many of the decisions that are made about people with serious mental illness, I think, are fear-based and are stigma-based and are not made by individuals who have the experience and the knowledge. And policies that are made out of fear are not going to be particularly helpful and will be harmful, I think, in some ways. Patience and tolerance. The patients I treat with serious mental illness want to be able to have the space to talk with someone who's listening to them, who's not looking at their clock, who's not worried about other things, and who is really listening with their ears. And I'm a psychiatrist. There are many psychiatrists who don't listen that well. And then finally, to be seen as people and individuals who have great deals of abilities, and that's in fact true, and to not always be seen by their pathology. And so systems of care, I do think systems of care can exist like this, but they have to have those core principles. You asked me about specific models. I don't know. I think things like greater access to housing, expanded funding for community programs so that they can really provide quality care, smaller caseloads, really intense work with patients, and perhaps even having care providers who span the different silos of care. So I'm in the jail. I would love to, if there were more people who worked in the jail and the community, to help sort of bridge that gap. And I could go on, but I think I'm going to stop for now. So thank you.
Thank you. And Dr. Belkin. Gary Belkin is the Executive Deputy Commissioner of Health and Mental Hygiene, the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene. And Gary, for you, we're wondering, as the Executive Deputy Commissioner of Health and Mental Health Hygiene for New York City, What do you think is the first line of intervention the city should take that would improve the health and well-being of individuals with serious mental illness here in New York?
So some people may be familiar with our attempt to answer that question, which has been a huge investment by the city of a number of efforts that go under the umbrella of Thrive NYC, which are essentially the idea that we need to optimize how everybody is a part of taking care of people. That our schools, our prisons, our daycare centers, our primary care providers, all of city government works to optimize the likelihood, and this is a phrase that someone used on the panel, I forget who, that we do what it takes to get well. And it seems like if we frame the question that way, what does it take to get well? Which is a dispassionate sort of question that we seem to be able to answer. We should build the opportunities that individuals, the stack is decked in favor of people getting those solutions that work for them. What I worry about this dialogue about the hospital, the asylum, is that it's often, at least in this country, with these politics and this administration, it shuts down the conversation, a robust, hey, how do we really have to build this so that it's more likely that people get what they need? And it seems like a more comforting solution to many of our problems these days to lock people up. And so I think it is now in our current culture, policy culture, shuts down a conversation that really needs to be opened up. Especially because there's actually very little evidence about the value of long-term hospitalization, and the little that there is suggests that it doesn't do as well as other community-based solutions in keeping people better. So I join in with folks who say the real questions and is my time up? Is that what that means? Is we shouldn't we need to retake the policy discussion and not settle for this idea that mental health has settled for, that there's a zero-sum game. You just have ACT teams, you just have hospitals, you just help moms who are depressed, you just help kids, start off well, who are traumatized. We have to advocate for the sort of set of solutions that are realistic to the scale and scope of the problem. That's what we try to put in place, that sort of comprehensiveness. We have to not work in workarounds. This country is unique in the degree that the jail system has become the mental health system. That says something about us and our culture and our jail system. It doesn't say that you have to have parity of hospital beds to jail beds to succeed. It says we really need to seize the discussion about a racist and stigmatized way that we police. And hopefully, if we lead the way as mental health advocates, we can return this. We've lost a faith in community as a source of solutions. And we really need to, I hope, stretch ourselves as much as possible to make that a place of safety, as you put it, and a shelter before we assume that it's not going to serve that purpose.
Thank you. As we were planning this session, everyone I spoke to said that it was the craziest idea to have this many panelists, and there was no way that people were going to stick to their time. So I want to say that you guys, you men and women, were amazing in keeping to the deal. So thank you for really thinking about these questions and being so clear in your messages. You've given us a lot to think about, and really by being so focused, gave us some really strong messages, I think. What I'd like to do is first invite the panelists, as you hear each other, Were there follow-on comments that you wanted to make, clarifying questions, things that in some way you wanted to ask or respond to one of the other panelists? Please, Pete.
You know, we're really coming full circle. In the 1700s, everybody was in jails and prisons. And then we developed the asylum system. Then we went to community. And now we're back in the jail and prison stage. And I want to pick up on what John and other panelists said. We're depending on the legal system to solve this, which is wrong. The truth is, we have asylums right now. And we have asylums that work. Gould Farm, Cooper Reese, McLean Hospital. The problem is, you got to be really rich to send your kid there. So we know about an asylum, and you can argue, and I agree with you, that taking someone out of the community is not good for good mental health, all right? I've seen that with my own son. But we know we can operate asylums, but I think we're very, very naive. I've covered Congress. I used to work at the Washington Post. If our government will not fund decent community services, why in the hell do we think they're going to provide the Gould Farm, McLean Hospital model? So if you got to be careful going down a road of saying, oh, we need modern day asylums, because by their nature, I'm not sure you'll ever get the public to fund anything better than what we had in the 60s.
Stefan, to connect your comments to Sudipto's comments, the experience of being in the institution, you said one of the impediments of that was that there were so many skills you didn't learn, right? You're taking out of the community. And Sudipto's point was that unless we get well in the community, we're going to be at a disadvantage. Does that resonate for you? Is that your experience?
It's never a situation where you try to understand from the system side to the community side. By giving the experience that I have experienced, coming from the institution side and just being discharged 3 years ago, one of my effects was overcrowdedness of psychiatrists. And I think that played a part of me getting discharged because the psychiatrist clearly said to the judge, I don't know what I'm treating. And now, you know, you have different psychiatrists come from different opinions, and, you know, the judge might play a part in saying, well, if you don't know what you're treating, how you know what you're diagnosing? So questions that leads up to questions, then it eventually turns into, well, if I keep this person here for a long time, is it really benefiting or is it really not benefiting? And then you throw yourself questions to that. So in some ways, with the asylum part of it, from a, you know, institution standpoint, I think that, you know, you get those overcrowdedness of psychiatrists and different things like that. But from the community side of it, I think the benefit that helped me was the supports. You know, you're coming from a support of people that have the lived experience, coming from people, even in the institution, that don't have the lived experience. So you get those two diverse situations where you can't, you know, ask yourself, am I really getting help from somebody that's in the institution, or am I really going to get the help from somebody that's in the community with the experience? So that comes with the question with that.
Thank you. Ellen, yeah.
So I just wanted to follow up a little bit about talking about the differences between England and America. I don't know if we have some British people in the audience. I was in the system in both places. And this date is back from when I was involved, so 80s. But at that time, England committed 3% of the population, of hospital population, including emergency commitments, and we committed 50%, not including emergency commitments. Except for hospitals for the criminally insane there, all wards were unlocked. Many wards are locked here. They haven't used mechanical restraints largely for over 200 years. Depending where you are, they're used a little or a lot here. That was one of the most toxic and traumatic experiences of mine, was being restrained for long periods of time. On the providing side, when I was in Oxford, which was a town of 125,000, there were 43 group homes for people who had been in the hospital. And I moved to New Haven, Connecticut to go to law school, same 125,000, one halfway house. If we don't provide services in the community, of course, the institutionalization is going to fail. And then the other thing is I wrote my memoir, and I had a British publisher, and I went back to see my old psychiatrist from 30 years ago. He looked exactly the same. It was very odd. Anyway, he said, his office building was right next to Westminster Hospital in London, where he saw half of his patients. And the other half, he went to their homes and he gave them therapy and medication there. And I know sort of at the far end of failure, we have home visits and so on, but why not make that the first step so we spare people the costs and risks of hospitalization? So I just think maybe studying other cultures in other countries could be helpful.
John.
Just a bit, just to build on that a bit, Dr. Scharff Steen, who's in the room, presented at the last APA conference a really interesting panel that brought together Australian researchers, Canadian researchers from Europe to look at, is there a breaking point for the system where you simply cannot provide effective community services because we've lost so many of those immediate crisis beds and those longer-term stabilization beds. And I think it's pretty clear that there is a number that can be discerned. And I think that's the sort of analysis, those things like the familiar faces, the question about how much are we actually spending? Pete's point, we're never going to be able to afford it. There are sheriffs all over the country who say, Bob, now that I've started to do this analysis, Bob has cost us $1 million. And Bob is no better off today than the first day I met him. So we're spending the money. We're just spending it on people rather than connecting with them and getting them better.
Yeah, I think it was something Dr. Belkin said. Maybe I'm
If you can pull the mic closer.
Dr. Belkin said, but maybe I'm misinterpreting him, is I didn't think that when you were talking about asylums, which is a tainted word which we may never be able to wash clean, that we were talking about creating another sort of new age institution. We were talking about an alternative to institutions that had the kinds of supports that go to Dr. Sachs's opinion of those people who are not committed to being, to engage. People who engage, we have all kinds of services if you're willing. But if you're not willing, you're going to be continuing to hit the emergency rooms and the hospitals and the jails. And just one other point. I don't think the jails are happy that they're getting all these folks. In fact, at least in Arizona, they're calling us all the time and saying, we do not want to be the largest mental health hospital in Arizona. So, but did I?
Yes, I think there's a larger political culture that has accepted that reality and does not have pants on fire to change it. But I also think that the other point I was trying to make is that I think mental health policy in this country has had a very narrow imagination of what is possible to do in the community. And I just worry that this turn to more institutionalized solutions, however well-resourced and more pleasant to be in, is further closing the possibilities. So we, for example, set up what is sort of a super ACT team in the city that we designed and worked on ourselves that takes care of folks who never have and likely never will engage in treatment. And we just go wherever they go. And it's mostly peer-led. We've had folks who came to us because of histories of violence that have not had violence during the several years they've been in the program. So I just think we can, and the looking at other cultures I think is really valuable because it gives us some perspective of the degree that our go-to, I don't think is McLean or the Gould's Farm or, but really smart supportive housing. So I just think there are ways that we can do this, but it requires a different kind of political will, and it requires more alignment of different parts of government to be able to succeed. It's not as easy.
Well, the reason I went through my son's litany was because all of those things kept him from getting engaged. And it was the system. It was the psychiatrist who brutalized him, getting thrown down and shot with Haldol, being told to bring him back, and then he breaks the law. And so, you know, we have to look at our system and stop doing it on crisis and do more to prevent them ever getting to law enforcement. We need the zero intercept, and I agree completely. Housing First, ACT teams. And part of the problem is we got to stop thinking about money. And John and I can talk a lot about how jails are more expensive and we can price it out and close jails like Judge Leifman's doing in Miami. But we need to start thinking about the person, and that's where we're not getting our message to the people who have the dollars. I mean, they're just not paying for it, I don't think.
Elizabeth, when you are discharging folks from your service, who are your partners? Where's the warm handoff?
So the answer today to that question is much different than it was 5 years ago. Part of the significant reform that's gone on in at least the New York City jail system, which has been well-funded, is to better connect people leaving the jail to the community resources. So it, just probably 3 years ago, there was different healthcare providers, but the message to the healthcare staff in the jail was do not contact anybody outside. And it was like a black box for people trying to get access to the jail. And that has completely flipped. So there's communication happening all the time within that jail. A big goal of our care is to try to have it be a part of the community in a way that it hasn't been. So for individuals with serious mental illness, there is significant outreach to care providers as soon as an individual comes into the jail and is identified. So jails, people churn very quickly. Many people are out in a week, and then we unfortunately have others who stay for years. But so very quickly up front, we'll try to contact individuals so that there's some kind of plan in place in the event that they're released, and we very rarely know when they're going to be released. So there's a lot of that connection. We try very hard to talk with family members. Sometimes we will do our own outreach to them because it's so hard for the families to get access to the jail. And so it's much different. The actual partners, I mean, hundreds. So with the Department of Health and with community providers, and there are a few agencies in New York City, thankfully, who really do embrace taking care of patients who are coming out of the jail system. And I would say that that's not universally true. I would like that to improve. So there are things in place. It is definitely not perfect, but that direction is where we're trying to head.
Thanks. And Barty, when you think about South Africa, how you're talking about leaving psychiatric institutions, not jails, but in the same way, you said the community programs weren't in place. What, from your experience, what are the steps that have been taken and what is helping? What are the building blocks that are getting put in place that make the most difference?
Yeah, just following the conversation that's taking place, what had happened is that we've learned from institutionalizing people is that it cut off any connection with the families. And out of this entire tragedy, what we found is that the most useful advocacy groups that did come out was the family committees that were formed in trying to identify their loved ones and what had happened to them, because the families were not informed as to where, their loved ones were moved to. And from that community engagement, there's now a sense of more involvement from families and a sense of wanting to be involved in the recovery plan. So I think even with community-based facilities, they are the recipients of mental health patients coming out of the psychiatric hospitals. So there should be a better link now between the community, the families, the mental health patient, and the community facility. And I think the problem we have is just in terms of resources. We don't have enough psychiatrists. We don't have enough infrastructure to house patients in independent living facilities. But the rise of family committees is positive for us.
Yeah, Ellen.
I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the commitment criteria, so grave disability, And one question is any homeless mentally ill person, by definition, gravely disabled, unable to provide food, clothing, and shelter? And then how do you say that the person who doesn't have mental illness and is homeless is not gravely disabled? So, I mean, one reason could be because we could treat the person with the illness and maybe get them better so they could find a house and so on. The other thing is, so that's one question, how to understand grave disability. A kind of funny story in my own case, you know, my commitment paper said I was dangerous to myself and others, and it said I was gravely disabled. And the reason they gave was I couldn't do my Yale Law School homework, which made me wonder about much of the rest of New Haven. But it does raise a question. Maybe if someone is at risk of like losing their profession or their reputation or whatever, that should count too. So I think that's an interesting question that we should collectively think about.
Yeah, please, Sudipto.
I mean, just listening to some of the things that the panel has highlighted, I think it's a very stark reminder that resources, you know, in the part of the world that I come from, and Shekhar knows very well, resources are at a premium. They're non-existent almost. But when I hear these stories of, you know, resources and rich countries and the pathways that we're going down, I think it's a very sobering lesson that this is not to be repeated at any cost. And I think, in a way, the advantage that, you know, of having limited resources is you've got to knock on doors. You cannot rely on existing infrastructure, existing teams, or even advocate for them realistically in the near future, because you know it's not going to happen. So that, in turn, I think leads to creating, in some of the instances that we've done, of a very broad range of very multi-sectoral partners who have nothing to do with mental health, except for the one thing that they want to contribute to something which is, you know, useful to society. So by tapping into that, I think there is a lot that can be achieved. And I think what you said, that the sense of the community has been lost because we've been so kind of obsessed with risk management and stuff of that nature. It really is a sobering thought, you know. So what I'm saying is that, you know, we have different circumstances, and sometimes, you know, not having resources or professional resources, but a lot of human and social capital is a very powerful tool to shift the narrative.
I've heard a number of words that just ring true in this conversation about systems, about humanity, curiosity, needing some imagination, resources, being heard, building skills, redefining recovery, not trying to go it alone, remember people first, and it's all going to depend on the social connection. Other words that stand out that I left out? Hope. I think that's a choice, resilience, support. So these are essential qualities that we think need to be part of what is reframing the narrative about the future. And what I'd like to do first in this transition is thank each of the panelists here who has shared his or her story and experience and passion and continues to say that what we have today is not good enough, and you're in on this journey to make things better for all of us, and actually really for all of us. What's good for someone with serious mental illness, a community that's good for someone with serious mental illness is good for someone with other illness, is good for someone with no illness. And so as we think about what that community should be, I want to thank each of you for your thought leadership and your passion. and I ask everyone here to join me in thanking our panelists today.